Well, we are absolutely thrilled. Welcome to CBST. If you have not been here before, I'm Rabbi Marisa James. I'm the Director of Social Justice Programming. And we are absolutely thrilled this evening to be welcoming Nati Passow, who has been teaching about the environment and Judaism and all of the different ways that our traditions and our planet overlap each other and inform the ways we understand both. So we're thrilled to have Nati here to be teaching us as we are entering the 7th year, the Shemitah year, which we're going to learn more about what that means. If you don't know the word Shemitah, you are going to come away from this evening knowing so much more. And if you know the word Shemitah, you're still going to come away from this evening knowing a lot more. So Nati, we're so thrilled that you are here. Nati currently works for Dayenu, the Jewish Call for Climate Action, and has previously run the Jewish Farm School. And we are just thrilled to have you with us. We're honored that you're going to lead us through. I love the phrase unfarming. That is actually something that was new to me, and I have really studied Shemitah. So Nati, I turn it over to you and welcome, and we're so grateful to have you.
Great. Well, again, thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here and excited to share a little bit more about Shemitah. But just by a quick show of hands, folks whose cameras are on, if you kind of give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, is Shemitah something that you have kind of heard of before and know a bit about, or is it something that is very new to you? So if you know a lot about Shemitah, stick your thumbs up, and kind of somewhere in the middle, or not so much, thumbs down. All right, so we got a nice mix, in the crowd tonight. So I'm excited to share a bit about Shemitah. Normally, often when I teach about Shemitah, I will teach about it over the course of 2 or 3 hour-and-a-half sessions. It's very rich. There's a lot to cover and a lot to get to. So in this kind of 1 hour, we're gonna try to consolidate some of that information in an efficient way and give you both kind of the broader context in which Shemitah exists, and as well as kind of cover some of the main, the most important elements of Shemitah as I understand it. And then at the end, we're going to think a little bit about, well, what does this mean to us, right? Many of us who are not necessarily farmers, and for whom some of the practices might not seem so relevant. So how do we, as we're rapidly approaching Rosh Hashanah and the beginning of this Shemitah year, how do we turn it into something that's personally and communally meaningful for us? So I want to start by sharing a bit about kind of my understanding of how the Torah and Jewish traditions see agriculture to begin with. Right? This is, if Shemitah is the year of unfarming, why does our tradition have a year of unfarming? What does our tradition have to say about farming to begin with? So we're going to start early on. You don't have to go very, very far into our tradition to get some ideas as to what Judaism has to say about farming. It really starts quite early in the beginning, in the creation story itself. So as many of you might be familiar with, we have kind of 2 creation stories in Genesis and Bereshit. The first one is I like to think of it as God doing a lot of very God-like things, God speaking the universe into existence. And then the second story is almost like from the farmer's perspective, as I kind of understand it, right? So we pick up here in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, of Bereshit, and we say, and God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there put the earthling, Adam, whom God had formed. And I use the word earthling very intentionally here because in Hebrew, there's this very, we think, oh, Adam is the name of the first person. And I'm familiar with that as a name, but actually we lose something in the English. In the Hebrew, Adamah is the word for earth, and Adam is the word for the first earthling, the first person who was formed out of the earth. And that perhaps if we referred to humans or people more as earthlings, then maybe we would kind of innately feel a stronger connection to the land and to the planet. And out of the ground, Adamah, God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life, and also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God took the Adam, the earthling, and put him into the Garden of Eden to work it and to protect it. So that is an important mandate that is given in this version of the creation story. Scholars refer to this as kind of the stewardship model, that this is the mandate that it's given to humans is li'ovda u'lishomra, to work it and to protect it, or to serve it and to protect it. And God commanded the earthling, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. So when I was in college, I went to a panel on faith-based environmentalism, and the Christian environmentalist had a great sticker that I wish I still had. It was a classical painting of Adam and Eve, and it said God's original plan was to hang out in a garden with some naked vegetarians. So this was the original vision, right? A stewardship model. The humans are in the garden. There's an abundance of food, but we're taught to not eat from this one tree. And Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who some of you might know, is one of the leaders of the renewal movement. He's here in Philadelphia, where I live. And I love his framing of this. He says, basically what God is telling the humans is, there is so much abundance. Look around you, there's so much abundance. All I'm asking is for you to show the tiniest bit of restraint. There's one tree that I say, please let that one rest. That's not for you. Well, as you may know, Adam and Eve are in the garden for like 20 minutes before they go ahead and eat from that tree. We don't have to go into all the details, but so God responds and says, and unto Adam God said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In suffering shall you eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to you, and you shall eat the grass of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and unto dust you shall return. So you can think of that as a punishment, you can think of that as a consequence, but what happens there is this transition from what had been this kind of stewardship model of the humans living in the garden, tending to the abundance and benefiting from the abundance, to a new type of relationship that humans are going to have with the earth, with the land. Cursed is the ground for your sake. There's going to be this more adversarial kind of relationship where there's a struggle involved, right? Instead of there just being abundance that humans will have access to, by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. We're going to have to work really hard in order to eat now. The relationship has fundamentally changed. One interpretation or reading of this narrative that I really connect to is that this is, in some ways, that what this is telling the story of is the story of the agricultural revolution. So we know that, does anyone know how long modern human beings have been on planet Earth? You can either shout it out or put it in the chat. Either one is fine. 10 million? Any other ideas? 100,000 years? Great. And what about farming? How long have we been farming for? Yep, exactly. Yeah. In a couple weeks, it'll be 5,872 years, exactly. Minus 6 days, right? Because humans were created on the 6th day. So, right. So modern humans, kind of as in the same general species as us, have been around for about 200,000 years, and we've been farming for maybe somewhere between 12 and 20,000 years, right? So for the vast majority of our time on Earth, we actually have not been farming. We like to refer to that entire period as prehistory. It's kind of like, prehistory. We'll just kind of dismiss that. And history really starts when we start to farm. And so one way of reading this narrative in really throughout much of the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, is that it's kind of telling the story of this transition, as Monica is saying, from hunting and gathering to agriculture, right? So in the Garden of Eden, it's depicted more as kind of gathering. All the humans and actually all the animals are all vegetarians. But we know historically that humans would hunt and gather. And then about 12,000 years ago, we started to figure out farming. And there's a couple of hints that this might be what's going on here. And we see it in a few places, but I'll just point out a couple of things in this text. So it says, "Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to you, and you shall eat the grass of the field." So one of the first domesticated crops that humans started to eat were grains, wheat and barley, and those are grasses. So that's a grass, right? Whereas on the previous text, it said that there's all these trees growing, and that is what's going to provide us with the food. But now in this transition, we're going to eat the grass of the field. And by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. And bread is almost the quintessential agricultural food product. It is, not only does it come from grains, but it requires a process of harvesting and drying and processing the seeds into flour, and then baking it using fire and very hot ovens. And all of that kind of happens once we start farming. That's not something that we were able to do when we were hunting and gathering. So, so what does it mean if our tradition is, I read this as not the most sympathetic view of agriculture, of farming. This is saying, there's this struggle, we're going to sweat, we're going to plant things, and thorns and thistles are going to grow. It depicts this very adversarial relationship between humans and the earth. So what exactly is the Torah referring to here? So first, let's think about what are some of the implications of early agriculture. So again, you can feel free to add answers in the chat. I'll go through a few of the main implications, but feel free to drop other ones in here as well. So one of the main implications of farming is division of labor and specialization. Anthropologists teach us that in hunting and gathering societies, pretty much everyone was tasked with the same role of going out and collecting food each day. That was kind of done in small family units, and everyone kind of had to occupy themselves with similar tasks. One of the good things about agriculture, about farming, is that it allows a person to produce, in a good year at least, to produce in abundance, to produce a lot more food than they need. And therefore, you can start to have some people focus on growing food for the community, and other people can start to focus on other things, like specializing tools or building. So you start to see division of labor and specialization emerge as a result of agriculture. Permanent settlement. As hunters and gatherers, we lived a migratory lifestyle where we would have to move with the seasons, with the rains, with the water. As we hunted and gathered in a particular area and resources dried out, we would move to a new area. Farming allows us to grow in abundance of food, a more predictable source of food. So it allows us to stay put and stay in one place. It also causes a population increase. When you are living in a migratory kind of way, you got to limit how many kids you have, because if you're moving every 6 months and walking long distances, you have to, you can only carry so many kids on your hip, right? And so you kind of space out the number of kids that you have, and you limit the number of kids that you have. When you have a farm, you want more help on the farm, so you have more kids, and you have an abundance of food to feed those kids. So it kind of that cycle feeds itself. Wealth creation. So essentially, when we can grow more than, if you think about wealth in the most fundamental way, wealth is having more than you need. It's having an abundance. And again, in a good farming season, you can grow more than you need. So wealth, to a certain extent, really becomes is a byproduct of agriculture. Before agriculture, you wouldn't want to accumulate too many things because, once again, you're moving on a semi-regular basis, so you can only carry so much with you. But once you have that abundance, once you have that surplus and that wealth, you have to protect it. And that's where militarization comes in. And because of the division of labor and specialization, we can now have certain people whose sole task is to protect that abundance, protect that surplus, protect that wealth. And so then what we also start to see are social and economic hierarchies. So who controls that abundance? Who controls the surplus? And that those become social, economic, and to some extent, even religious hierarchies, right? In some of the early civilizations, you have a lot of overlap between the priestly class and the wealthy. They were kind of on the highest level of the society. And finally, all of that leads to this proliferation of culture and what we call civilization, right? Civilization really emerges out of agriculture. Let's see what else we have. We domesticate animals to do work and provide meat and manure. That's true. And literacy, that's why history starts with agriculture, right? I think again, this specialization really allows people to specialize in things like art and music and writing and language, and all of that allows for this kind of culture and civilization to proliferate. So what we see here is obviously a lot of benefits to agriculture. I'd say one of the main benefits to agriculture is that, today I've eaten 2 meals, I've had a cup of coffee, and I didn't have to do anything other than buy those things at a store, right? And that is all thanks to agriculture and our very robust and complex food system right now. But what we also see here are some real challenges, right? Or some potential problems. We have these hierarchies. We have the militarization. You start to see the need for land to increase. So the militarization leads to war and conquering other lands. So there's some good and some bad that come along with agriculture. And we actually see this later on in the story of, in the book of Bereshit, of Genesis. Well, if we fast forward several generations, we get to the story of Joseph. Joseph, having been sold into slavery by his brothers, ends up becoming kind of the viceroy of Egypt, working closely with the Pharaoh. And he interprets the Pharaoh's dreams famously, that there will be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And he advises the Pharaoh to, during the 7 years of plenty, to tax the nation and collect a lot of that surplus and hold it. And so now the famine hits. And as we see in this text, now there was no food in the entire land, for the famine had grown exceedingly severe. And the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were exhausted because of the famine. And when the money gave out in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone." So they used up all their money to buy whatever surplus they had access to. And so Joseph, thinking somewhat, he's a shrewd businessman, Joseph, and he says, "Okay, well, give me your livestock and I will give you your food." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle and the donkeys, and he provided them with bread that year in exchange for all their livestock. So in year 1 of what's going to be a 7-year famine, he's already now, no one has any money left, and now they've given Joseph all of their livestock, all their animals, which are a means to generate income and livelihood for them. So now we're just in the 2nd year. Now that year ended, and they came to him in the 2nd year, and they said to him, "Nothing remains before my Lord except our bodies and our farmland. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our farmland? Buy us and our farmland for food, so that we and our farmland will be slaves to Pharaoh, and give us seed so that we will live and not die, and the soil will not lie fallow." So Joseph bought up all the farmland of the Egyptians for Pharaoh, and for the Egyptians sold each one his field, for the famine had become too strong for them and the land became Pharaoh's. So in just 2 years, Joseph and the Pharaoh are able to accumulate a tremendous amount of power and wealth, where essentially after just 2 years, all the Egyptians have sold all of their animals, they've given all their money, they've given all their land, and they've given their bodies over to Pharaoh. And so in just 2 years of scarcity in an agricultural society, whoever is controlling that surplus, controlling the wealth, has a tremendous amount of power. Now, the Israelites are part of this story, right? If you might remember that Jacob and his sons are living in Canaan, and they're not farmers actually; they're shepherds, but they're impacted by this famine as well, and they go down to Egypt. This leads to the reunion with Joseph, and at first it's great, right? It's good to have friends in high places. They show up. Joseph sets them up with prime pasture land for their flocks, and kind of protects them. But soon enough, Joseph dies and the Pharaoh dies and all of those people of that generation die, and the Israelites have grown and grown and grown, and the new Pharaoh comes along and does not like these Israelites and ultimately enslaves them. And so what we see is this is the first time that our ancestors are really part of an agricultural society, is they are on the oppressed end of things, right? Egypt was one of the great civilizations, but we also know it was a tremendously oppressive civilization that really grew and benefited on the unpaid labor of the masses. And the Israelites are part of that story, right? So that's really what our ancestors' first exposure to being part of an agricultural society is like. As we know, there's the Exodus story. We leave, we wander in the desert. An interesting kind of footnote here is we wander in the desert for 40 years, and what is the food that we eat in the desert? It's the manna, right? I see some people mouthing it, right? The manna that falls from the sky each day. And every day people go out and collect what they need for that day. And it even says that you may not take any extra. If you take any extra, it will spoil. With the exception on Fridays, you take a double portion for Shabbat so that you don't have to go out and collect food on Shabbat. So to me, this sounds a lot like gathering, right? We've kind of left this oppressive agricultural society, and as a way of kind of cleansing the palate, this is how I think of it, the way kind of cleansing the palate, we revert to a gathering way of life. And then it's going to be time to enter back into Canaan. And the text is very clear. It says, "For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. There, the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors like a vegetable garden. The Nile River would flood each year, and that allowed the Egyptians to create these vast irrigation channels, which allowed them to pretty much grow food all year round and have an abundance of water. And so it allowed them, I think of that as kind of like the earliest versions of industrial agriculture. You have unlimited water and unlimited labor. And that allows you to really flourish, at least for the people who are on top in that society. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the divine Holy One and serving God with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. I will also provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill." So for the first time as a nation, we are going to become farmers, right? We're going to enter this land and we're going to become farmers, but we're going to do things in a strikingly different way than what we've experienced in Egypt and what was happening in kind of the other great civilizations at the time. We're going to farm in a different way. And that leads to a Jewish agricultural blueprint that includes a whole set of laws that, as I understand them, are really meant to preemptively prevent some of the challenges that we saw in Egypt or that you see in agricultural societies historically. So some of these might be familiar to folks, but we have basically we have a set of Jewish agricultural laws that make sure that the needs of the most vulnerable people of our community are centered and being met. So in this picture, you see someone harvesting from the corner. This is the biblical agricultural law of Peah, of leaving the corners of our field unharvested, so that those without land can come and harvest and get some of their own food. We also leave the gleanings for people without land. We do ma'aser, tithing. We take 10% of what we harvest and we donate it both to the poor and also to the priests, because one of the ways that our tradition separates power is that the priestly class is actually the one class that's not allowed to own land, and as a way of kind of keeping a check on their power. So they are dependent on the charity of the farmers. We have laws about how we treat animals, about how we treat workers. This is a very robust agricultural blueprint that is very different than what we see in Egypt, and it's very different than what we see in like a contemporary food system. Farming has continued to this day to be one of the most oppressive industries out there, not only around the world, but also in the United States. When the labor movement was really taking root in the early part of the 20th century, farm workers were excluded from unionizing and from labor rights. And even to this day, farm workers are not subject to minimum wage requirements, right? So farming continues to be an inherently oppressive industry, but our tradition early on recognizes that and offers a bunch of remedies to that. And in my mind, the pinnacle of this blueprint are what I think of as the concentric circles of Shabbat and Shemitah and Yovel, and I'll explain those in just a moment. So we see in this text, "You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt." So you might know that phrase. That is the phrase that is most repeated throughout the entire Torah, and here it is as the lead-in to the first time that Shemitah appears in the Torah. So, "We shall not oppress the stranger, for we know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beasts eat of it." And then a few lines later, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, in order that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and that your bondsman and the stranger may be refreshed. So this, and then so we have a weekly Shabbat every 7 days. Everyone in our society, in our community, is required to rest, is not allowed to do any work. You don't have to be Jewish. You don't even have to be human. Animals in our society are given Shabbat and are not allowed to do work on Shabbat. Now, if you think about that, in modern times, we might take the weekend for granted a little bit. We might think, of course, everyone has at least 1, maybe 2 days off a week. But if you go back to that time historically, whoever took time off? It was only the wealthy and the elite of any given society. But Shabbat comes along and says, on a weekly level, we're going to smash that hierarchy. We're gonna flatten it. We're going to say that whether you're rich or poor, everyone gets to keep Shabbat. And I saw something very recently online saying that a cause that the progressive Jewish world should really get behind is making sure that all Jews who want to keep Shabbat can keep Shabbat. Because in our contemporary society, we know that for a lot of poor people, you can't take a day off of work. That's impossible. And what would it look like for the Jewish community to rally behind this cause and say, let's make sure that everyone, even if you're very poor, we're going to support you in keeping Shabbat and taking Shabbat. So every week we kind of flatten the hierarchies and everyone gets to experience that day of rest. Every 7 years, we're going to let the land rest, and we'll get more into that in a moment. And every 7 cycles of 7 years, after 49 years, in the 50th year, we have something called Yovel, the Jubilee, where it's like another Shemitah year. But in addition to all of the practices of the Shemitah year, we also, all land returns to its ancestral origin. So, and the Israelites came and conquered the land of Canaan. Each tribe was given a region, and then within each region, the land was split up amongst families. And over the course of 49 years, that land might get bought and sold and traded, and some people would start to accumulate more property and other people would lose property. But in the Yovel, a shofar is blown, and it's kind of like a giant economic reset. I think of it as if you're playing the game of Monopoly, as many of us probably have, which usually ends with one person having all the money and everyone else bankrupt, and often like some sort of family feud that has ensued out of this game. That might work for a board game, but that's not a great recipe for a society, right? We don't want a society where all of the wealth is concentrated amongst just one or a small minority of people. So imagine you're playing Monopoly, and it's going on and on and on, and some people are getting more money and some people are getting less money. And now instead of the game ending, we blow a whistle or we blow a shofar, and we say, okay, everyone throw your properties back in and let's redistribute it equally to everyone. Why? Because the point of the game is that it never ends. The point of the game is that it just keeps going and going and going. And what we've seen historically, both in ancient times and in modern times, is that when you don't have that sort of economic reset, bad things happen. When you have wealth concentrated amongst a small minority of the population, eventually the majority of the population rises up against that. And what our tradition tries to offer is a remedy to prevent that from happening in violent ways. And so every 50 years, basically once in a person's lifetime, hopefully, they would experience this reset. They would not have to, if their parents or grandparents had made some really poor financial decisions, they wouldn't necessarily have to suffer because of that. So in a moment, we'll get into some of the specific practices of the Shemitah year, but I just want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions or comments from what we've said. And you can either kind of raise your hand or use the raise hand button or drop them in the chat. Everything is fine. Okay, great. We'll get into the specifics of Shemitah now. So, so this is the context in which Shemitah emerges. And as we're talking about this, I want us to kind of hold the memory of the Garden of Eden in mind, right? If the Garden of Eden was the original design, but then life happens and society happens and civilization happens and all of this stuff happens, but we're still holding on to that memory. Okay, so the agricultural practices of the Shemitah year. There's no agricultural activity. You're not allowed to farm. You're not allowed to compost. You're not allowed to plant. You're not allowed to prune. You're not allowed to do anything that benefits the land in any way or kind of contributes to agricultural productivity. And in fact, some of the limitations actually start before Rosh Hashanah. They actually start about 40 days before Rosh Hashanah hits, because you're not allowed to do certain things in advance of the Shemitah year that then would really have their impact during the Shemitah year. All land becomes commons. So all agricultural land becomes ownerless in the Shemitah year. And one of the ways that manifests is that you have to take down or open up your fences. If you remember in the text about Shemitah, it says, "Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they don't eat, let the wild beasts eat of it." You're not even allowed in the Shemitah year to prevent wild animals from coming onto your farmland and eating the plants that grow. Which, if anyone has ever grown food in a vegetable garden or on a farm, a big part of what you're trying to do is keep the wild animals out. And so to kind of say, okay, you're throwing up your arms and you're welcoming them in is a pretty radical change. All food that grows on its own is hefker, is available to anyone. So, right, plants don't necessarily need us humans to do anything for them to grow. If you've had a vegetable garden, you know every year you probably have something that gardeners call volunteer plants, plants that show up on their own because the previous year the tomato fell in the ground and you didn't harvest it and it sat there and the seeds sat in the soil, and then the next year when the conditions were right, they started to grow. All of that is fair game in the Shemitah year, except it doesn't belong to you anymore. It doesn't matter that that's your farm. That is now hefker, that is ownerless, and anyone can come and eat of it. Yeah, another big food source in the Shemitah year are perennial plants, right? So plants that grow year after year without humans needing to plant them. So right now, our food system is very dominated by annual crops, primarily corn and wheat and soy and rice. But if you think about the 7 species of ancient Israel, 5 out of the 7 are fruit trees, are fruit. So that's a perennial, that's going to grow year after year on its own. And the other 2, wheat and barley, are grains that actually, if you've ever grown wheat, a lot of it falls on the ground, and it's hard, once you have a wheat patch, it's hard to get rid of it because every year the seeds from the previous year will just start growing on their own. So all of that food is available to anyone. And all of that food that has grown during the Shemitah year has something called Kedushat Shvi'it, the sanctity of the 7th year, and that you have to treat it differently than you do other food. It can only be harvested when it's ripe, and it has to be used in its most elevated form. What that means is that take something like olives, right, which we know is a common crop in the Middle East. Some might say that the highest form of olives is preserved olives that you eat as the fruit with the pits inside. And other people might say, well, the olive oil is the highest form. So I'm not exactly sure how this gets decided, if it's a personal thing or if there's kind of a universal understanding of what's the best version, but you have to keep that food in its most elevated form. You also aren't allowed to throw it out or dispose of it kind of like trash. Basically, during the Shemitah year, the food that grows on its own has a special holiness innate to it, and we have to recognize that. And lastly, eat local. Only fresh crops that are actively growing in your region can be consumed, right? So let's say you noticed some tomatoes that were growing on their own, and you went out and took a few in and put them in a bowl in your kitchen. And that night there was a really hard frost, and all the tomato plants outside get frozen and die. You can no longer eat the tomatoes that you had brought in, because you can only eat the things that the wild animals have access to. So you have to eat things that are local and in season during the Shemitah year. Now, if you're asking, well, like, how could you possibly have enough food? You can also have stored food from previous years, and that's what the Torah actually says, is that the 6th year will be so abundant that you will have so much surplus that you will store that will carry over through the Shemitah year and even into the next year, into the first year of the next Shemitah cycle, to kind of keep things going. Now, there's another aspect of the Shemitah year which is incredibly profound, and I think points to the fact that ancient Israel was an agricultural economy, right? So agricultural policies are also economic policies. And it says here, at the end of every 7 years, you will make a release, a Shemitah. This is actually the only time that the word Shemitah appears in the Torah. And it means release. This is the nature of the release. Every creditor will release what they loaned their neighbor and their sibling, as it is declared a release to God. So at the end of the Shemitah year, any debts that are outstanding between neighbors and friends get wiped out. And I only learned recently that it was at the end of the Shemitah year that the debt gets canceled. And I heard a really great explanation for that. And that is because when you're a farmer, it's actually not necessarily a bad thing to have to borrow money, right? You have a lot of expenses at the beginning of a season. You have to buy your seeds, you have your tools, you have to pay your laborers. And you don't actually make your money until you're starting to harvest and sell the produce. And so it's common for farmers to take on debt at the beginning of a season and then pay it back at the end of the season. So the debt that is still outstanding at the end of the Shemitah year means that's debt that is outstanding after a year where no one was farming. And so that is the debt that gets erased. This is the kind of debt that might really weigh someone down, that might prevent them from moving out of poverty. That is the debt that is forgiven at the end of the Shemitah year. So just taking a quick look. Yes, exactly. The CSA model is basically meant to address that, right? That's what the CSA model is. You give the farmer the money up front at the beginning of the season, and then you get repaid throughout the year with produce.
And for those of you who don't know, CSA is community supported agriculture. I know in some parts of New York, these are possible, but you basically, it's like you buy a share of what's being produced at a farm before you actually know precisely what you're going to get. So it's really investing long-term, both in the health of the farm and in the health of what's going to wind up in your refrigerator.
Yeah. And Sage wrote, I wonder if that has anything to do with why derogatory marks on your credit score don't impact your score after they've been there for 7 years. That is actually correct. My understanding is that, like, when you declare bankruptcy, which is essentially a releasing of debt, right? That stays on your credit score for 7 years, because our society, you know, the founders of this country and the early kind of thinkers of our economic system were mainly religious Christians, and they were familiar with this concept. And there have been other examples back in right in the lead up to the year 2000, the millennium. There was a whole global movement called the Global Jubilee movement, which some of you might remember, which was an effort to erase third world debt, kind of forgive the debt of developing nations that they owed wealthier countries, and using the language from the Torah around this. So the economic practices of the Shemitah year. So anything that grows, Shemitah produce cannot be sold in a typical manner. It may be sold in small quantities informally, but can only be sold by estimate. And I really love that little, like, that nuance there. In the Torah, it says very explicitly that we have to have accurate scales and measures, so that when we're selling things in the market, we have to make sure that we're pricing them accurately. But during the Shemitah year, you might bring in a couple of bowls full of tomatoes, and your neighbor wants some, and you say, okay, yeah, I'll give you some, but you just kind of eyeball it. Yeah, why don't you give me a couple shekels, and here you can have some. And I love that is kind of the approach in the Shemitah year. We kind of let go of the kind of obsessive, detail-oriented nature of commerce and capitalism, and become a much more kind of like a bartering kind of economy, or a more friendly kind of economy. Shemitah produce cannot be exported, so it cannot be taken out of not only the country, but as I mentioned earlier, you can only eat the things that are ripe and available in your region. you can't even move Shemitah produce outside of that region. Certain agricultural tools cannot be sold to someone in the Shemitah year for fear that they will violate the Shemitah. There's a lot in the texts around the rabbinic texts around the perception of whether you've kept Shemitah or not, and so there's rules like this one where we can't even sell tools to someone. It's almost like the concept of muksa, if you're familiar with that, for Shabbat. For some people, the way they observe Shabbat is they won't even touch something that they don't do on Shabbat. So, like if you don't spend money on Shabbat, you might not even touch money on Shabbat because then it might lead you to spend the money. So it's almost like that. We can't even sell the tool, even if you're not planning on using it till after the Shemitah year, because there's a fear that then they might violate the Shemitah year. And then at the end of the Shemitah year, the debts are released. And then lastly, the release of slaves. And this is kind of interesting. It's connected to the cycle of Shemitah in kind of the biblical prescription for indentured servants is that if you owe someone money and you can't pay it off, you might enter into an indentured servitude agreement with them. And the terms of that are 6 years. And then in the 7th year, you're released from that. Now, the Shemitah year, from a farming and economic perspective, that happens at the same time for everyone. So going into this year at Rosh Hashanah, the Shemitah year starts for everyone in the whole world. It doesn't matter if you've been on your farm for 1 year or 6 years, everyone's on the same page with that. The release of slaves happens on an independent cycle, but in the text, it's mentioned right after this text about releasing debt. And so in my mind, it's very much connected, even though it happens a little bit on its own cycle. So one way of understanding these practices is that in an agricultural society, the path that someone might take into poverty, you're a farmer, but you're not a very good farmer. So the first thing you might do is borrow some money to help, put food on your table. But you're still struggling. You're not that good at farming, and so now you're struggling to pay off the debt, and you don't have any money. So you sell your land. You take that, and then you repay the debt. But now you don't have any land, so you don't have any source of income. So again, you're forced to borrow money, or maybe you enter into an indentured servitude kind of agreement. So Shemitah kind of tries to hit all of those steps, right? The debt is forgiven, all land becomes commons and shared by everyone, and slaves are released. So again, this is, in my mind, very much kind of the pinnacle of this Jewish agricultural blueprint that is meant to preemptively address some of the challenges that we see in agricultural societies. Was Shemitah ever practiced historically? Is there any record to indicate that this was actually ever practiced? Yes, it's a great question, whether Shemitah was actually ever practiced. There is, as I understand it, there's evidence that Shemitah was practiced, and also that it wasn't practiced. In Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of Our Fathers, it says that exile will come upon the world for failure to observe the Shemitah, and that apparently there was some calculation that I think the 70 years between the destruction of the first temple and when the Jews were allowed back into the land corresponded to 70 Shemitah years that were not observed, or something like that. But there's also evidence that it was kept. And in fact, there's even evidence that some of the tribes settled in what today would be, I guess, Lebanon, which is technically not inside the boundaries of biblical Israel. And yet those tribes also kept Shemitah because they were part of the same economic system. So the agricultural aspects of Shemitah only apply in the biblical land of Israel, but even in ancient times, there were people living outside of that, but adjacent to it, who kept it in order to be part of the same system. Now, what I've also learned is that there's no real indication that Yovel, that the Jubilee, the great economic reset every 50 years, was ever actually enacted. That's my understanding, that we don't think that ever happened.
And
Okay.
Nati, can I just add that so I mentioned before the event actually started that 14 years ago when I moved to Jerusalem, it was also a Shemitah year, and Shemitah is absolutely still observed, not in all of the precise ways, right? As you say, some of them, yes, it was observed, and no, it was not observed. But absolutely, there's Shemitah signs so that you know which growers are observing some of these rules, which borders it's important to observe these rules within, for people who really care deeply about them, to know what they're purchasing and how it's been produced.
Right, and you know, this was a basically moot question for, you know, close to 2,000 years, and it was only in the late 1800s when you started to have masses of Jewish immigrants starting to come back to the land and starting to grow, you know, be farmers on the land, that this question of what to do about the Shemitah year came up. And essentially, the way that Shemitah is practiced today in Israel, it primarily relies on a few rabbinic loopholes to kind of avoid practicing Shemitah in its full way. Although that is starting to change. I think last Shemitah year, the government actually created a fund to support farmers who wanted to actually keep Shemitah and not farm, and gave them at least some modest income to observe Shemitah. But most farmers in Israel, as I understand it, kind of participate in one of two different legal loopholes that allow them to keep growing food. But it does kind of change things, so that if you go to the market, you know, if you go to the market in Jerusalem on Shemitah year, you'll still be able to get plenty of produce. As Rabbi Marissa said, there'll be a lot more signage explaining why it's okay to buy that produce. But there actually is a kind of a cool system that's essentially like a nationwide CSA program. As we mentioned earlier, one of the loopholes is that farmers farm and the government pays them a salary for their labor, but not for the food itself, because you're not allowed to sell the produce. And then so the produce just becomes owned by the government, and then people pay in to be part of the system, and then they get a weekly box with produce. So there's a couple of kind of creative loopholes, but there's a growing movement of farmers that are actually trying to do this. So I want to just kind of close with what I think of as, you know, as someone who, you know, I have a garden and I've been neglecting it quite a bit to practice for the Shemitah year. But aside from that, you know, I'm not a farmer. I'm not so much in the practice of making loans to people. So, you know, what does Shemitah mean to me as I get ready for Rosh Hashanah? How can I kind of bring this practice into my life in a meaningful way? And one of the nice things about not being a farmer in Israel is that, like, we don't have to be bogged down by the legalities of it. We can kind of be inspired by some of the bigger ideas behind it. And so I think a lot about the idea of a personal release, and just this idea, right? Like, we spend so much of our time kind of trying to control things, trying to hold on to things. And what would it look like to really embrace this idea of release? So one question I like to ask is, what debts are you holding? Maybe they're economic debts, but they might not be. There are other types of debts. We often, in our relationships, we might feel like somebody owes us something. They owe us an apology, or they owe us a phone call, they owe us a visit, they owe us some recognition or acknowledgement. And maybe that's actually interfering with our relationship with them because we've been holding on to that. And maybe there's something that we can let go of. What would it look like for us to release, whether it's that debt that we're holding over someone, or some sense of control or ownership? Just letting go, right? What would that look like? I think in the last 18 months, a lot of us have had to learn how to let go our expectations, of our plans, of our sense of predictability, and really kind of, you know, and so maybe we've gotten a lot better at it. And what do we have to do between now and Rosh Hashanah, which is only a couple weeks away, to prepare for the Shemitah year? And what type of personal Shemitah project might we want to take on for the coming year, right? What is something that we can really focus on and use the Shemitah year as an opportunity to step back and reflect, right? There's a beautiful quote by, I believe it's Rav Kook, where he says that like during the Shemitah year, we'll basically, we won't have to be preoccupied with doing things, that we'll be able to pursue new interests and study Torah and just waking up to the world in a new way, right? You often hear of people who in their retirement, they discover that they're actually wonderful painters. They never knew because they were always so busy. But what would it look like to not wait till we're retired to do that, but embrace that during the Shemitah year, right? And the academic world has embraced this practice through sabbaticals, and some other businesses and institutions have taken on the sabbatical practices. But you know, I think in small and big ways, we can all kind of think about it and try to find meaningful ways to embrace it. I want to close with one last thought, and then address a couple questions in the chat or any other questions that might come up, which is that in the Torah, it says very explicitly that if you don't keep Shemitah, then the land will take Shemitah itself, that the land will basically kick you off of the land. It will take its own Shemitah, because one of the texts says that the Shemitah really is about a Shabbat for the land. And, you know, a year and a half ago, when the whole world went into lockdown, my first thought was, is this what it's like when the land takes its rest? Is this what's happening? That the earth has kind of spoken to the humans and said, hey, enough already. You know, if you're not going to take this Shemitah, if you're not going to pause and reflect on your relationship to the planet and to each other, then I'll force you to do it. And for, you know, there was a couple weeks where everything just felt like quiet, and like it felt like otherworldly to me. And that was just the thought that kept going through my mind, was whether this was kind of the land taking the rest that it needed. So I invite us, as we go into the Shemitah year, to own that, to embrace that, and try to embody these values and practices in ways that we find rejuvenating and renewing and meaningful for us. I do want to just look at a couple of quick questions. Marilyn asked if gleaning is part of this. I mean, I certainly think gleaning is part of the Jewish agricultural blueprint that tries to ensure the needs of everyone are being kept. And then during the Shemitah year, everyone basically becomes gleaners, right? Because no one owns the land anymore. So everyone just goes out and takes what they need for that moment. The question about the vegetable waste you would normally compost it's a good one. It's weirdly technical. My father and stepmother live in Jerusalem, and I was in Jerusalem during the Shemitah year 14 years ago, and I was like asking her about it. They're both Orthodox, and so they're following these laws very carefully. And the Shemitah produce, the stuff that grows during the Shemitah year, has this holiness, and you're not allowed to throw it out. And so I said, "Oh, you're allowed to compost it?" And she said, "No, you're not allowed to compost it, because that would be an agricultural activity." It's okay. So what do you do with it? And she said, "Well, what you do is you put it in this plastic bag and you tie a knot, and then you throw it out, because then it won't break down when it's in the plastic bag." And I thought, that seems very odd to me. But that is apparently kind of, again, that's where in my mind, when you get focused on the legalistic aspect of these practices, sometimes you end up with kind of some funny conclusions. But that was, that struck me as quite strange. And then lastly, what's the significance of 7, right? So 7, I mean, it's a great question. One of the things that we have that has struck me about the number 7 is that there's a lot of cycles of time that are visible in nature, right? If you were just in the forest with no clocks and nothing, you could observe a day, right? The sun comes up, it moves across the sky, it sets, it's nighttime, and then it happens again. You could observe a month by watching the cycles of the moon. You could observe a year by watching, by experiencing, seeing the sun in the sky and the seasons and the length of the days. But a 7-day week is not something we can really observe in nature. And yet that has really stuck as the unit that has worked for, it's kind of amazing that the whole world operates on this 7-day week structure. And I learned that during the French Revolution, Napoleon, the metric system comes out of the French Revolution, that they were revolting against everything, including these like non-rational measurement systems. And so everything was base 10 as part of the French Revolution. And he tried to institute a 10-day week, and it just didn't work. It just didn't work. And so the 7-day week. So I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I mean, I've also heard there are 7 planets that are visible with the naked eye. There's a few other ways that 7 shows up in nature, but I think of it as it's this kind of cosmic merger between the divine and humans that we have in our story, a 7-day creation process, and that somehow that's just kind of the magical recipe. And so I kind of like to think of that there's something kind of divinely inspired or somehow is divinely infused. So, yeah.
Nati, thank you so much. This is such a great journey. I feel like there's so many pieces of our tradition that have woven themselves into the way we live our lives in ways that we don't necessarily know about. And then there's so many pieces of our tradition that are not necessarily woven into our lives daily. And so there are these moments where it's like, oh wait, there's this whole thread of what does it mean to farm? What does it mean if we're asking ourselves to rest, if we're asking our animals to rest, how do we extend that to every living creature, every part of the planet? And right, yeah, it is, right. I've been kind of watching the comments as well. Some of the ways that this is and isn't observed and was or wasn't observed. Some of it's people trying to just make sense of their world and trying to make sense of what they think God wants from them. But there are these deeper ideas of, how do we understand our own relationship to our own rest, our own need for renewal, our own need to make sure that we're lying fallow sometimes. And even if Shabbat, especially if you're a rabbi, Shabbat is not always the day that you get to lie around in your pajamas and do the things that restore your soul, but making sure that we are taking that time. And sometimes 1 day a week just is not enough, as we know. We also know that it's actually a huge blessing that our senior rabbi is about to go on a sabbatical, mm-hmm. Right? This comes from that she will be probably not lying fallow if we know Rabbi Kleinbaum for 6 months. But we do, hope that the idea of taking extended periods of rest means that we come back and we're able to be more fruitful, that we're able to be more, generating beauty in the world. And so it'll be interesting to think about what are the ways that this can maybe help us, and these texts and these beautiful thoughts can help us imagine this year being more intentional about giving ourselves those ways to sink back into the soil so that we can grow up stronger.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'll just point out there, Chazon is, some of you might be familiar with Chazon, one of the larger Jewish environmental organizations based in New York. They've done a ton of work on Shemitah, and if you look on their website, they have some really fabulous resources, and every week they have a weekly commentary on the Torah portion through a Shemitah lens, and so that's a great resource to kind of plug in a little bit more. But I remember seeing this video that was it was a TED talk by a guy who runs a like a design firm, and they created a sabbatical policy where every 7 years the whole firm shut down and everyone had a paid sabbatical, and they found that everyone was coming back with new ideas and new visions, and the clients were even happier. Like it actually yielded better results. And I think there's something counterintuitive about it, and it's very subversive in a capitalist society to suggest this. But I think there's some profound wisdom there, and there's a lot that we can benefit from.
Well, thank you so much, Nati. This was lovely. This is so interesting. And thank you all, and thank you for your comments in the chat and your questions. And we will definitely make sure that we are sharing more of this information and more of these resources, so that, right, we're 2 weeks away. If you walk outside and you see the full moon, that means it's 2 weeks until the holidays. And we'll make sure that there's some more good stuff circulating if you're looking for more ways of thinking through this stuff. But we're so glad that you're all here with us, and thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Shana Tova. Thank you so much.
A little bit of fruitful and a little bit of schlepping down into the pajamas and letting yourself grow into what's next.